framework for future communist society, in particular, a framework for economic structure. This is a framework, not a concrete plan. It can be adopted to many different conditions, and even the adoption of mere components or ideas can be helpful to workers' movements. This framework will reveal a mode of production which is much more alien to capitalism than any past or present socialist societies ever had. Regression to capitalism should therefore be less likely. This is a framework which has relevance today. It works even if you assume limited resources and non-complete automation. Of course, either of those things would be unrealistic today. This framework is equitable and robust in its organization of economy. It is, however, most suitable for countries with nearly ubiquitous internet access and some centralized computing resources. It also can operate within a single country or small group of countries. To be clear, an economy will be defined as the system which determines how goods and services are produced and distributed. For every good and service, it must be allocated to one individual. This is the distribution half. Likewise, for every job, it must also be allocated to one individual. Now, this is in some ways a slight simplification, but is close enough to reality. Basic concepts. This framework will refer to a survey. A survey, as referred to in this framework, takes the form of score voting. It can be imagined similar to Amazon or any service which involves reviewing options. Individuals will evaluate options on some scale, perhaps 0 to 5 stars in the case of many online platforms. It ultimately doesn't matter very much. The surveys that will be described later would end up being extremely long. This is not really a concern because people wouldn't need to fill in the surveys in their entirety. Reasonable default values could be chosen, and surveys could be enhanced in such a way as to group together related options and allow them to be surveyed as a whole. Surveys will be deployed for distribution of both goods and services and jobs. Individuals will be asked for their job preferences as well as for their preferences on non-essential goods and services. It's worth noting that necessary products would be distributed equitably. However, there is room for preferences there to be collected and considered. For example, different types of food. The last basic concept is that of aggregation functions. These take some operation over an entire group to simplify it into a single value. For example, summation is an aggregation function whereby you add all the values in a list. Basic framework. Work. Through a mechanism which will be lightly examined later, one job will be created for each adult capable of work. Then individuals and jobs will be matched to maximize an aggregation function. Essentially, the societal maximum for job satisfaction such that all of the work is done will be achieved. Of course, deciding how to aggregate isn't as simple as it may seem, and it's up to philosophers, and fundamentally, it's up to the people to decide democratically how preferences should be aggregated. This example is the square root of the preference. The purpose of taking the square root is that greater weight is given to low statements of preference. Essentially, someone with a low preference for a job will not be put into that position just to give someone a slight improvement from a job they feel neutrally about to one they have a high preference for. It's worth noting that, of course, there would be certification so that only qualified individuals will do certain jobs, like that of doctors. Finally, computing this aggregation is computationally not an obstacle. Essential goods and services will be distributed to everyone who needs them. These are including but not limited to housing, healthcare, electricity, food and water, waste disposal. For non-essential products, the question becomes more interesting. Here is defined a way to calculate the value of products. Namely, the value of any product is a summation of the value of its components combined with the labor required to assemble the components. For products which have no component parts, the value is that of a raw resource, added cost, which is based upon scarcity and can also be defined with some other modifications to take into account externalities related to extracting or using that resource. Product values this way defined are similar to but better than market prices under capitalism. They can correctly account for externalities if those externalities are understood and imparted onto the products. They also correctly value automation. Capitalist market prices undervalue automation because labor is purchased at its exchange value rather than its use value. Therefore, these product values can also be extended to even further improve them. For example, the desirability of the jobs involved in the creation of the product can be taken into account. This can help guide automation towards undesirable work. To continue describing how non-essential products will be distributed, we will consider it like the problem of work distribution. Individuals and products must be matched to maximize an aggregation function. Additionally, the value of products and the satisfaction for that particular individual must be considered together with a democratically decided function. For example, 1 over the value times the satisfaction could be the total net value to be given for that product and individual pairing. The logic for this example is simply that products which are more labor intensive and resource intensive to produce be given a comparatively higher weighting than those which are simple to make but still provide the same amount of satisfaction. Of course, there are several complications. It's absurd for products to begin production when someone decides they want one. Instead, they must be produced ahead of time so that they will be ready when they are needed or desired. This is especially important for medicine and other less important commodities like wine and silicon chips. It should be noted at this point that it is possible to essentially give different values to different people. This is analogous to paying different people different amounts. They will have access to relatively more non-essential products than other people. There are many reasons why this may be necessary or even desirable. First of all, keeping highly skilled individuals within the socialist country may require giving them certain privileges. It may also be used as a way of incentivizing work. That said, within this mode of production, that is not the default. That is naturally an anomaly. To continue describing production, demand would be estimated, and then production would be scheduled to meet those demands. In a centralized collaborative system, these estimates would be more accurate than capitalist estimates. In particular, production would be planned through directly asking people what they will want, rather than by fabricating demand through marketing. When a product is assembled, then a suitable target for delivery must be determined. Remember that even if the previously mentioned simplification doesn't include that product being delivered to that person. It makes no sense to have products wasting away in warehouses. They should be distributed to someone. Of course, this does make things slightly more complex. One possible solution is that total value provided could be stored for each individual, and then distribution would be to maximize aggregation of value provided over their entire lifetime per unit of adulthood. To try to illustrate this, imagine a cell phone is produced and a delivery target is needed. The system can go through, look for someone who has both a relatively high desirability for that product, the cell phone, as well as being relatively below the average in terms of value provided per unit of adulthood. That would make a good match, and then the product will be delivered to that person. While this may seem complicated and undesirable, it's worth noting that how this would work out in reality is much more like Amazon than what it sounds, perhaps. Most people would simply decide if they want something on a website of some kind, and it could be delivered virtually immediately, assuming they haven't already been provided their fair share of products. One interesting question is this system subject to being gamed? Essentially, could people abuse the system by lying? The answer is, without external markets and with normalization, not really. After all, giving a low desirability to expensive products would indeed result in one of them or more of them being delivered to you. But unless you can then exchange that, it won't help you. You'll just have some useless nonsense that you didn't want. As briefly touched upon before, the value function could be improved by considering the average desirability of a particular job. Even if this extension isn't desirable though, work which is too onerous that no one wants to do it and only produces non-essential products or services should not be done. For example, if no one or insufficient people have any desire to shine shoes, that job should cease to exist or be in very low access. Or of course it could be automated. One other idea which could be pursued is that less desirable work is given lower hours to the point where it becomes more desirable, or so that the desirability of all work for the workers who do it, not for the general population. If there's a subset of the population which enjoys certain work, then that is fine. Transport costs are already accounted for in production and could be accounted for in delivery. This might unfairly punish those who have high transportation costs, though perhaps incentivizing them to move to less remote places isn't necessarily the worst in any case. The planning of production chains is an important component. Of course, at first they would simply be duplicates of the existing chains, so that basic necessities continue to be produced. In the current conditions, socialist societies would need to plan production chains through bureaucrats, as they are done today. However, these chains would be more transparent, leading them to potentially be more efficient. If anyone spots a potential source of inefficiency, it could be pointed out to the bureaucrats and they could improve it. The planning of these production chains would likely become automatable as technology improves, and it's quite possible that even while there remain people doing all sorts of jobs, the planning of production chains would have very little human involvement. An important component of an economy is that it continues to innovate. Within this framework, there would be opened a new way to foster innovation. There would remain the old one, that of bureaucrats deciding where to allocate resources to. But there could also be another democratic one, utilizing surveys in a way somewhat analogous to crowdfunding internet services like Kickstarter. The public can give support to projects they find appealing, and if they get enough support, those projects can be allocated resources and labor as appropriate. Of course, there would be transparency and accountability in a way that there isn't today, because these projects would be backed by the public and all public institutions.